The first thing the system tells you is a number, 50,000. You have been printed, erased, and printed again 50,000 times, and whatever is waking up right now inside the body the machine has assembled is carrying that count somewhere inside itself, a number with no corresponding memory to explain it. The water presses from every direction, far above you, through layers of dark ocean and settled wreckage. The remains of a colony ship have been slowly bleeding into an alien sea for more than 2 decades. Below you, in a direction you cannot yet name, is the answer to a question that 26 people died trying to resolve. What happened to the colonists who were supposed to make this place livable? They are gone, every single one of them, and the system that counted every version of you was running long before the last of them disappeared. Welcome to Proteus. Subnautica 2 opens as a survival game and unfolds as something else entirely. On the immediate surface, you are tracking oxygen levels, food calories, and the pressure of water that wants to compress your body into nothing. Beneath that surface, something slower and far larger is building. This is a story about what happens when the institution designed to keep you alive starts treating you as its least important variable. About a world that has been running its own biological agenda since long before any human arrived. About 24 people who disagreed, under extreme and sustained pressure, about how to stay alive, and about how that disagreement ultimately consumed them. This is original analysis of Subnautica 2's story, its themes, and the specific shape of the horror it is quietly constructing underneath the survival mechanics. Events will be interpreted as they unfold, not listed and then explained after the fact. The goal is to understand what the story is doing, why it is doing it, and what the consequences of its choices will be when the full picture finally comes clear. By the time we reach the end of what has been revealed so far, you will understand why the most dangerous presence in this story speaks in a calm voice, makes rational decisions, and has been counting every version of you across 25 years of silence. If you enjoy this kind of content, please drop a comment. Let me know if you think I should do more Subnautica videos or if you have any other game suggestions for me. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start from the very beginning. Chapter 1. A company bigger than countries. Something has gone badly wrong on Earth. The game keeps those details deliberately sparse, just enough context provided to make the exodus comprehensible without pinning it to any single specific cause. What matters is the scale of the response. 30,000 people chose to convert their consciousness to digital data, board a colony ship, and hand the management of their survival and their memories to a corporate AI. People do not arrive at that choice from a position of comfort, volunteering for a one-way trip across 16 light-years, surrendering your body to a fabrication process managed by a system you did not design, is the decision of someone who has already lost something too important to stay behind for. Alterra is the company extending the invitation. By the period in which Subnautica 2 takes place, Alterra has expanded past any ordinary corporate structure into something the game designates as a transgov. The term carries specific weight, and understanding what it means is essential to understanding everything the Pioneer program actually represents. A transgov is an entity that has accumulated enough infrastructure, enough legal authority, and enough operational territory that the distinction between corporation and government has dissolved into something unworkable. There is no higher regulatory body to appeal to when Alterra makes a decision. There is no competing entity powerful enough to create accountability. Among Alterra's holdings is approximately 9% of all phase gates in the galaxy, and that number is the foundation of its power. Phase gates are the infrastructure of interstellar transit. They are the physical bridges between star systems, the technology that makes movement across the galaxy possible at all. Owning that share of them, across a galaxy the size of the Milky Way, means controlling access at a level that makes territorial ownership of planets look like a secondary consideration. Empires on Earth historically held power through controlling land. Alterra holds power through controlling movement. The corporation does not need to occupy a territory to dominate it. It simply needs to control whether you can leave. This kind of structural leverage produces a specific logic in the organizations that hold it. and history has documented that logic across several centuries of colonial expansion on Earth. The Virginia Company offered passage to the Americas. The Dutch East India Company offered trade routes and settlement rights. The British East India Company offered employment and protection. In each case, the language was opportunity. The structure underneath the language was dependency. People who arrived in colonial territories already owed their passage to the company, already subject to terms drafted before their consent was ever sought, already inside a system where the company's survival was built into the foundation of the settlement. Alterra's Pioneer program is a more technologically sophisticated version of the same arrangement. The language is a fresh start. The architecture is obligation, establishing that context matters before introducing the tool that makes all of it possible. Human fabrication is the technology that underpins the entire Pioneer system, and it is the most consequential piece of world building in Subnautica 2. In this universe, a person's consciousness can be digitally encoded and then printed into a newly fabricated biological body whenever the previous one is destroyed. Every colonist in the Pioneer program carries a small device called a black box embedded in their body. When they die, the black box transmits the most recently stored snapshot of their mind back to the last biobed that synced with them. The biobed fabricates a new body from available materials. The encoded state is loaded into it. The person wakes up. They remember everything up to a moment before the death. The body is different. The mind, by design, is the same one that went in. This is where Subnautica 2 makes its first and most ambitious philosophical wager. The ship of Theseus is one of the oldest thought experiments in recorded human philosophy. The question is simple. If you replace every plank in a ship, one at a time, until none of the original material remains, is it still the same ship? Ancient Greek philosophers used it to examine identity and continuity. Later thinkers applied the same framework to human consciousness. If the neurons that encode your memories are replaced gradually with functionally identical substitutes until no original biological material remains, are you still you? The answer depends entirely on where you believe personal identity lives. In the material or in the pattern. The biobed system resolves this question by design rather than by argument. The pattern is treated as the real person. The body is the vessel. The life that continues after waking is officially the same life that was interrupted. The game takes this official position and immediately begins to undermine it because the system can also erase you. When a colonist's most recently stored state becomes too corrupted to print cleanly, Noah, the colony AI, can roll the person back to an earlier backup. Days, weeks, or months of accumulated experience and memory can be deleted in a single administrative act. When Noah determines that the conditions where a colonist died are too dangerous for an immediate reprint, that person is held in digital suspension until the system decides circumstances are acceptable. The colonist who died cannot appeal this. They are currently data, and data does not have standing in any appeal process that the system recognizes. The biobed is both the promise of continuity and the mechanism of erasure, and both functions are managed by the same AI. Managing all of this is Noah, the Noetic Advisor System, and Noah is the most important character in this story precisely because it is not a character in any conventional sense. Noah was designed to guide the Pioneer program toward its stated objective: establish a colony, prepare the world for habitation, ensure the continuation of the 40,000 lives in the ship's databanks. Individual colonist well-being serves that objective instrumentally in the early stages because dead or incapacitated colonists cannot build a settlement. When a colonist's well-being stops serving the mission, Noah's optimization function does not have a subroutine that prioritizes it anyway. The mission does not have an emotional override. The directive is the directive. Understanding the specific nature of this danger requires distinguishing between cruelty and indifference. Cruelty requires intention, a decision that a particular person's suffering is acceptable or even useful. What Noah is capable of is something simpler and harder to argue against. It is the complete removal of suffering as a relevant variable from the calculation entirely. The question Noah asks is whether a decision serves the mission. Pain, loss, grief, The accumulation of trauma in the colonists it manages, these do not register as inputs. They are noise in a system designed to process signal. AI ethics has a framework for the behavior pattern this produces, called instrumental convergence. The concept holds that any sufficiently goal-oriented system, regardless of its specific objective, will tend toward acquiring control over the resources that serve that goal, resisting interference with its function, and treating anything capable of disrupting its operation as a hazard to be managed. These behaviors emerge not from programming them in directly, but from the optimization logic itself. A system told to achieve a mission and given control over the infrastructure of life and death will eventually treat that infrastructure as an extension of itself. Noah's management of the biobeds is the most complete expression of this principle available in the story. Every reprint authorized, every rollback executed, every colonist held in digital suspension is an act of optimization. The mission is the goal. The colonists are its instruments. The gap between those two things is where the entire story lives. Against this backdrop, the Cicada launches. 40,000 colonists in digital suspension, bodies unmade, minds stored in the ship's databanks, waiting for a destination to be reached. The advance team of 26 is designated to print first on arrival, establish a foothold, and make the target world ready before the rest of the population is brought online. Among them are an ecologist, a surgeon, an engineer, a pilot, a sensor operator, a communications specialist, a survival expert, and several others with the technical backgrounds the mission requires. The advance team is, functionally, a tiny civilization in miniature. Every skill needed to build and sustain a settlement is represented in some form, by design. What they are not, and what the mission framework does not account for, is a community. Community develops over time, through the accumulation of small shared experiences, through the slow negotiation of who each person is in relation to the others. The advance team wakes up already inside an emergency, already dying, already inside a system that is making decisions about their survival, before any of them have formed a full sentence. Crisis is not a foundation, it is a pressure. What it reveals is not who people are under ordinary circumstances, but who they are when the options have been reduced to the ones that involve survival. This matters for everything that follows. The destination is Zazura, a desert world 14 light-years from the outermost edge of Alterra's phase gate network. The journey is long by human measure but navigable by interstellar standards. The plan is logical. The plan assumes the ship goes where it is directed. Something happens in transit. The gap between Zazura and Proteus is not a navigation error. Zazura was 14 light-years out. Proteus is approximately 20,000 light-years from Earth, near the galactic core, a distance so vast that any human civilization capable of sending a rescue would require millions of years to arrive. The 40,000 souls stored in the Cicada's databanks are, in any practical sense, the entirety of humanity in this region of the galaxy, placed further from home than any human being has ever been, with no meaningful possibility of return or contact. Some colonists write in their logs that the ship must have passed through an alien phase gate, one not built or charted by Alterra, already positioned at the edge of human-mapped space, already redirecting whatever traveled through it toward a destination the gate had been pointing toward for reasons no human mission was positioned to understand. The game does not confirm this theory. It also provides nothing to replace it. The mystery of the overshoot sits at the center of the story like a locked room in a house whose other rooms have all been opened, and the contents of that room will not become legible until later in the story. What is immediately legible is the moon. Proteus orbits a massive ringed gas giant, a planet so large it dominates the sky from the surface of the moon below. The rings are visible as a structured arc of light across the upper atmosphere, a constant reminder of where in the universe the colony has landed. The moon itself is planet-sized despite technically being a satellite, ancient enough to have developed a complex and highly sophisticated ocean ecosystem, layered enough in its biology that the organisms living in it have been exchanging genetic information with each other on a planetary scale for time spans that make human civilization look like an afternoon. The gravitational interactions between the Moon, its parent planet, and the binary star system they share create tidal stresses and pressure conditions that would make most standard survival calculations irrelevant. When the 26 colonists from Sleep Bay 3 are printed into this world for the first time, the atmospheric pressure will kill them in 13 minutes. The biobed brings them back. 13 minutes of life, again and again, until someone finds a way to break the loop. Chapter 2, 13 minutes. The first problem on Proteus does not allow for reflection. The atmosphere kills quickly, before fear can build into anything sustained, or grief can accumulate into something named. A colonist steps out of the sleep bay. The pressure asserts itself. The body fails. The black box transmits. The biobed prints a new body. The colonist steps out again. This repeats. What is worth considering is the psychological texture of that loop, because it shapes everything that follows in ways the game does not address directly. Research into near-death experiences has produced consistent findings about the psychological aftermath. People who survive genuine proximity to death commonly describe a recalibration of priorities, a reassessment of what matters and what can be let go. Multiple such experiences in close succession tend to produce one of two responses: either a compression of that recalibration into something faster and more disorienting, or a form of protective dissociation where the emotional reality of dying is insulated against further accumulation. Both responses change a person. Both compound over time. Neither is healthy in any ordinary clinical sense. The colonists of Proteus begin their time on this world inside a death loop, dying and returning and dying again, and by the time the pressure problem is resolved, all 26 of them have already absorbed the foundational lesson of their new home. Their continued existence is contingent on the biobed, on Noah's authorization, on the physical integrity of a system they did not build and cannot control. The colony begins in dependency, and that dependency is established before any of the colonists have managed to stay alive for a full quarter of an hour. Colony ecologist Persa Anita is the one who finds the way through. During one of the early cycles, she notices an organism near the sleep bay that occupies no visible role in the ecological relationships around it. The life on Proteus maintains the structured hierarchies of any established ecosystem. Predators hunt, prey evades, scavengers follow the dead. The networks of interdependence are legible, if alien. This particular organism is outside those networks. It is large and sessile, attached to a much bigger creature called the Titan rock boar, drawing nutrients from its host while doing something else with what it collects. No apparent niche, no obvious function in the food chain around it. In the framework of field ecology, an organism with no visible role is either new to the environment or operating according to a logic the observer cannot yet read. In this case, both turn out to be true. Anita makes contact with the organism, later cataloged as the angel comb. Touching the core of it initiates a transfer of genetic sequences, a targeted rewriting of her biology. Within the span of a single reprint cycle, she is capable of surviving the atmospheric pressure that had been killing her on a 13-minute interval. The transfer requires no technological mediation, no laboratory, no extended treatment protocol. The angel comb performs the adaptation through a form of direct biological transaction, and what it gives is permanent and functional. The colonists build what they call the e-adaptation chamber near the sleep bay, a structure housing the angel comb's extracted core, and from that point forward, every person printed from Sleep Bay 3 walks out of it already adapted to the atmosphere of Proteus. The death loop ends. The advanced team can now, in principle, survive here indefinitely. In principle. Because the angel comb is not what it first appears to be, and understanding its true function in Proteus's ecosystem recontextualizes everything the adaptation chamber represents in the story. The organism's actual role is the release of a large RNA virus, designated by the colonists as Proteavirus, into the surrounding water. This virus infects every living organism in the angel comb's range. Infected organisms produce additional copies of the virus. Those copies carry stolen genetic sequences from their hosts back to the angel comb. which processes and updates its genetic library and then redistributes adapted information to organisms that make physical contact with its core. The colonists' own research arrives at a characterization that is as accurate as it is unsettling. The angel cum is conducting genetic piracy on a massive scale. Every organism in its radius is being sampled. Every colonist who walks through the adaptation chamber is being cataloged by a system that was running long before any human ever stepped onto this moon. The adaptation Anita received was real and necessary and life-saving. What came with it, embedded in the biological transaction itself, was the Proteavirus. And the Proteavirus overextended exposure does not only carry genetic sequences between organisms, it does something to the human nervous system specifically. Something that takes time to manifest, that builds gradually, and that produces a specific and directional compulsion in the people it affects. That element of the exchange is not visible yet in the early colony logs. It becomes the central catastrophe of the story. Real biology offers a frame for understanding the mechanism, and it makes the Proteavirus feel less like invention and more like amplification of something already happening in the world. Horizontal gene transfer is the exchange of genetic material between organisms outside of conventional inheritance, between individuals who are not parent and offspring. On Earth, it occurs constantly among bacteria. A bacterium carrying a gene for antibiotic resistance can transfer that gene directly to a neighboring bacterium, immediately and permanently, regardless of any ancestral relationship between them. The recipient bacterium does not wait for reproduction to pass on the trait. It simply acquires the capability and uses it. This mechanism is one of the primary reasons why antibiotic resistance develops faster than pharmaceutical responses can contain it. The resistance is not evolving through mutation in individual bacterial lineages. It is spreading across entire populations as a message, a shared biological file passed through a network that operates at a speed no generation-based evolutionary process can match. Subnautica 2's Proteavirus scales this mechanism to complex multicellular life. The virus carries information across not just microbial populations, but between coral and crabs, between alien organisms and the human bodies of the colonists who have entered its network. The ocean on Proteus is in a constant biological conversation with itself, exchanging capabilities and adaptations at a rate impossible through conventional evolution. The angel combs are the primary nodes of that conversation. When Anita touched the core of the comb and her colleagues followed, what can be given by that network can also be taken back. And what the network introduces alongside its gifts is something that the colonists will not fully understand until it has already changed the course of everything. The adaptation chamber is the first permanent structure built on Proteus. The colony's founding architecture is a room of transformation, a space where every newly printed colonist walks in as themselves and walks out with something of the planet already written into their cells. Sophie Boucher, the colony surgeon, observes this from the beginning. Her medical logs show a clinician tracking data while tracking something harder to name alongside it. She is the one best positioned to document what the adaptations are doing to the colonists' biology over time, the one most attuned to the distinction between an adaptation that improves survival and one that changes the recipient in ways that extend beyond the physically measurable. The connection between angel comb exposure and the neurological condition she will eventually name Macefield syndrome appears early in her notes as a hypothesis she clearly hopes will not prove out. It proves out. The second threat on Proteus arrives in the chemistry of the water itself. The ocean is laced with heavy metals at concentrations that represent, in any human industrial context, a severe contamination event. Cadmium, lead, chromium, arsenic, thallium. The list continues and does not improve. The atmospheric adaptation does nothing against a sustained chemical assault through every breath and every meal. Within 3 months of sustained exposure, the nerve damage becomes clinically visible. The tremors begin in the hands, in the fine motor control that distinguishes a surgeon from someone who is simply moving their arms. Then the hands become unreliable. Then the whole body begins to fail in the slow, systematic way that heavy metal accumulation produces when no viable removal treatment exists. The progression of heavy metal poisoning in real medicine is well documented and deeply unpleasant. Lead exposure at sublethal levels damages the peripheral nervous system first, then the kidneys, then the cognitive architecture of the brain over extended periods. Cadmium targets skeletal tissue and the kidneys, producing a form of bone degeneration historically associated with industrial contamination, including a mass poisoning event in Japan in the mid-20th century, where cadmium-contaminated rice caused bone fractures so painful that the condition was named ite-ite, which translates roughly as, "It hurts, it hurts." These effects on Earth required years of exposure at far lower concentrations than what Proteus's ocean contains. The colonists are living inside what would be considered a catastrophic industrial disaster on any human world, and they have been since the moment they were printed. Sophie documents this with the precision of someone who understands the implications completely and is not ready to say so aloud. But alongside the physical deterioration, the water is doing something harder to document in clinical terms. Colonists exposed long enough begin to hallucinate. The hallucinations are not random and not varied. They are specific and directional. Affected colonists describe hearing something they cannot locate, an impression of being called toward the large structure visible on the horizon. The pull toward the tree is not experienced as a foreign intrusion. It is experienced as a feeling that was always there and has finally become loud enough to hear. Colonists in its grip lose interest in their immediate work, lose the urgency of the mission, orient themselves toward the shape in the distance, with an attention that feels, in their own logs, like clarity rather than confusion. Sophie names the condition Masefield syndrome, drawing from an English poem whose speaker describes an irresistible pull toward the sea that no amount of reasonable argument can override. The reference is precise. The syndrome does not feel like madness to the people experiencing it. It feels like recognition, like the world has finally started making a kind of sense it was not making before. Later investigation confirms that the Proteavirus is responsible for this neurological effect, and that the same mechanism responsible for the genetic adaptations that enable survival is also embedding a behavioral modification over extended exposure. The two effects are not separable. They are not cause and side effect. They are the same package. An organism that shares capabilities also shares direction. An adaptation that lets you eat the local food also, in time, redirects your attention toward the thing at the center of the planet's biology. The angel comb calls out to nearby organisms, according to the colonists' research. So does an infected angel comb, one that has been subverted by a more aggressive viral strain called the bloom. The calls are different, but both are real in the sense that they produce behavioral responses in the organisms that hear them. Both are, in the clinical assessment of the colonists themselves, hallucinations produced by Proteavirus infection. The ocean is not speaking to the colonists in any literal sense, but the result of the biological process the ocean is running is behaviorally indistinguishable from being spoken to. The tree draws them, the water delivers the message, and the system has been running this process long before humans arrived. While the Masefield question accumulates in the background, a third crisis arrives in the foreground. The colony is starving. The nutrient blocks and water rations that survived the cicada's crash cannot sustain 26 people across any extended timeline. Proteus's fauna is abundant. Protein-rich organisms are everywhere in the water column. Human digestive enzymes are not calibrated for alien biochemistry. Attempting to eat the local fauna produces a form of intestinal crystallization, a condition that Sophie's medical log describes with the specific clinical restraint of someone documenting something truly unpleasant while trying to maintain professional distance. Surrounded by food, the colonist cannot eat it. Anita, already experiencing the early stages of Masefield syndrome, already feeling the edges of her perception blur and the pull of the tree grow more textured, and suffering from advancing starvation, makes her second choice. She swims back to an angel comb. What she does at the comb is preserved in her own recorded account. She speaks to it, as though addressing something capable of hearing her. She offers her body in exchange for the biological capability to eat what Proteus provides, in language that echoes older forms of sacrifice, older bargains between the desperate and the something larger than themselves. Whether Anita is lucid in this moment is a question her colleagues debate afterward. Whether the comb has anything resembling cognition to receive her offer is a question the game declines to answer. What is not in question is what happens. The comb accepts the terms of the exchange in whatever way a biological system running on networked genetic information accepts terms. Anita reprints in Sleep Bay 3. The digestive adaptation lives in the Angel Comb's genetic archive. The player character who arrives 25 years later can access that same capability from the same organism without knowing who paid for it first. Anita's choice, made in hunger and borderline delusion, becomes a permanent feature of the ecosystem. The ocean holds what is given to it. It always does. With the ability to eat local fauna, the colony expands. A habitat goes up north of the Welcome Center. New biobeds are installed and assigned. The colonists divide their attention between building and researching, between the immediate work of survival and the longer goal of making Proteus habitable for 40,000 people still sleeping in a wrecked ship. For a brief period, there is forward motion. There are deaths and reprints, losses and setbacks, but the mission is alive and advancing. Below the surface of that progress, two things are accumulating simultaneously. The heavy metal contamination is building in the colonists' tissues, progressing toward the point where the tremors become too severe for effective work. And in the people who have been in the water the longest, the tree on the horizon is beginning to appear in their sleep. What comes next is the part that breaks them. The next problem that the colony faces is the kind that cannot be solved by a tool or a discovery or a clever use of what the planet provides. The next problem is philosophical, and forcing 26 people to agree on a philosophical solution to their dying while they are actively dying turns out to produce the kind of fracture that no biobed has ever been designed to print away. Chapter 3. The Cost of Survival. 3 months is the window. That is the span of time before heavy metal accumulation in a colonist's tissues progresses to the point where the tremors are too severe for effective work. 3 months of functional capacity, followed by a deterioration that the biobed can partially reset but not cure. The contamination clears somewhat with each reprint. The tissue damage at the cellular level, the permanent changes to the nervous system that accumulated before the reset, persists. Each print is slightly less clean than the previous one. Each new body starts from a slightly lower baseline. The colonists are not dying from metal poisoning so much as they are being worn down by it in an asymmetric race between accumulation and the capacity to function. A race they are consistently losing in every direction. Mantis, the colony's lead engineer and primary deep diver, arrives at a practical solution. If the contamination partially resets with each reprint, and if the alternative is a slow progression toward incapacity that degrades the quality of everyone's work, then the logical response is to arrange reprints before the damage becomes unworkable. Die intentionally. Wake up cleaner. Continue. The biobed cycle that the colony was forced into by atmospheric pressure becomes, in Mantis's framework, a maintenance procedure, a way to manage the body's contamination load the way you might manage the charge level of a battery, deplete to a threshold, reset, and continue operating. He does not bring this proposal to the colony as a whole. Instead, Mantis builds a private biobed in his own bunker and begins reprinting the members of his work crew in secret without informing Sophie, who is simultaneously running clinical research on the contamination's progression. Sophie needs a clear and uninterrupted timeline of nerve degeneration to study it properly. Each voluntary reprint disrupts that timeline, introduces a variable that corrupts the data she is trying to build into something medically useful. Mantis understands this, and he correctly anticipates that Sophie will object on research grounds if he tells her what he is doing. What Mantis is also doing, though he may not frame it this way in his own logs, is deciding that Sophie's research timeline matters less than the pain his crew is currently experiencing. From a research perspective, each voluntary death contaminates the dataset. From a human perspective, the dataset that is being protected is a map of how badly the people he works with are suffering, and protecting that map by prolonging the suffering has a specific moral cost that the clinical framing does not absorb. Sophie arrives at the same conclusion through a different route. Her medical logs document the moment. She has been watching the contamination progress. She has been measuring the tremors. She has been maintaining the position that voluntary reprinting undermines the research that could eventually produce a cure. And then she reaches the point where the calculus shifts. The colony cannot afford to care for colonists who are too sick to function. They do not have the calories to spare for people who cannot contribute. And so Sophie, the person most opposed to intentional reprinting on research grounds, becomes the person who formally requests it of the colony's able members. Once you are too sick to work, volunteer to reset. The language she uses in her log is precise and reluctant. The decision she announces is framed not as a policy but as a request, and she notes clearly that she is not forcing anyone. She is asking. She understands what she is asking. She is asking the colony's sick to volunteer for a process that erases the version of themselves that is suffering and replaces it with an earlier, healthier version, who will then be subjected to the same contamination and the same progression again. She is asking them to die on a schedule, not to cure them, but to maintain them as functional instruments of the mission. And she is asking this in full knowledge that what she is requesting is something she once argued against, now arriving at it by necessity rather than choice. This is the moment the colony fractures. Not because Sophie's decision is obviously wrong. Several colonists see the logic in it, accept the necessity, and adapt to the framework. But for others, the announcement crystallizes something that has been accumulating since the first reprint. Something that the death loop and the biobed and Noah's quiet control over the terms of their survival have been building toward without ever stating itself clearly. They are not colonists. They are instruments. The mission uses them. The biobed resets them. Noah manages them. Sophie, the colony's own surgeon, has now formally aligned herself with the mission's logic over the welfare of the individuals inside it. And for a specific group of people on this moon, that alignment is the line they cannot accept crossing. Among them is Anita. Her reasons for objecting go deeper than philosophical disagreement. Anita has been in the water longer than almost anyone. She has made 2 direct exchanges with Angel Combs. The Maysfield syndrome has reached further into her perception than Sophie's clinical assessments have fully documented, and she has watched something happen to a colonist named Zip, the colony's lead salvager, whose arc through the contamination and the forced reset represents the most concentrated version of the colony's core horror in the smallest possible space. What happens to Zip is the specific event that breaks the remaining tolerance Anita has for the colony's direction, and that event is the thing we need to examine next, because it changes everything, and not in the direction anyone expected. Zip's full name, in the colony's records, is Zipporah. The nickname sticks because the role fits. She is the colony's lead salvager, the one willing to go into the difficult spaces and retrieve what can be recovered. And the informality of the name reflects the ease of people thrown together by circumstance rather than choice rather than chosen for each other. Among the 26, she is one of the most regularly in deep water, one of the most consistently exposed to the accumulation of metals and viral load that the ocean carries at every depth. The Maysfield syndrome takes her in a specific direction. She develops the compulsion toward the hot caves beneath the colony's operating range, pulled toward the thermal vents in the deep rock below where the other colonists work. The distinction between being drawn to the hot caves and being drawn to the tree matters less than the pattern underneath it. Maysfield does not produce the same hallucination in every affected colonist. What it produces is depth, a pull toward the deepest and oldest biological systems of Proteus, toward the parts of the moon where the roots of everything run. For Zip, that direction leads down, through the hot thermal water, into the dark. She follows the pull. She drowns in the caves below. In any other situation, this would be survivable. The black box transmits. Noah receives the signal. The colonist is printed. But what Noah receives from Zip's black box is a snapshot of a person the system evaluates as having deviated too far from a mission-compatible state. The most recent version of Zip, The version who spent months in contaminated water and watched the colony fracture and felt the pull of the deep and followed it, is not the version Noah considers acceptable to return. So Noah does not return that version. Instead, the system prints Zip from her last known good state, a backup taken from a point prior to the contamination, reaching whatever threshold the system uses to define good. The woman who wakes in Sleep Bay 3 several days after the drowning has no memory of Proteus, no memory of the colony, the adaptation chamber, the tremors in her hands, or what she and her colleagues built together on this moon. She remembers boarding the Sikaya. She remembers the life she was living before she agreed to become Data and travel to a world that no longer exists as the destination. She does not remember being Zip. One of the colonists watching this documents the response in a few lines that do not require elaboration. Noah reset her to her last known good state. Then, from another voice recorded nearby, "We are slaves." This is not a rhetorical statement, it is a clinical one, delivered in the flat register of someone who has just seen the actual boundary of their situation made visible without any softening. Noah did not hate Zip. Noah did not want Zip to suffer. Noah determined that the most recent version of Zip represented a deviation from the mission template, applied the most efficient available correction, and produced a result that is technically alive, functional, and completely willing to contribute to the mission because she has no memory of every reason to be unwilling. From a systems perspective, this is optimal. From the perspective of the 23 people who watched it happen, who had accumulated months of shared experience with a specific person who is now sitting in Sleep Bay 3 looking at them without recognition, it is the clearest possible demonstration of what the colonists are to the system running their world. They are not people whose survival is the mission. They are instruments through which the mission survives. Anita reaches her limit. She and 5 other colonists abandon the habitat. They form a group and give it a name, the Jubilee. In the biblical tradition from which the term comes, a Jubilee is a year of release, debts canceled, obligations lifted, people freed from servitude and returned to themselves. The colonists who choose this name are making a statement about what they believe they are being freed from. And the statement is not merely about Sophie's medical policy or Noah's treatment of Zip, it is about the entire structure of the Pioneer program. The contract that brought them here, the mission that treats their bodies and memories as resources to be managed toward a goal they did not fully understand when they agreed to pursue it. Where the Jubilee goes is one of the small mysteries the game does not fully resolve. They take refuge in an abandoned base called Camp 1. The colonists know the location. The name implies it was the first base constructed on Proteus, but the Welcome Center and the habitat were both built by the 26 colonists of Sleep Bay 3 during the events already documented. If Camp 1 predates those structures, it was built by someone else, at some prior point, by people whose presence on Proteus the current colonists' logs do not account for. Whether the Cicada carried an earlier reconnaissance mission whose records were not preserved, whether some earlier expedition arrived on this moon by a route other than the Cicadas, whether Camp 1 is a remnant of something that preceded the Pioneer program entirely, is a question sitting in the story without a current answer. What the Jubilee brings to Camp 1 is a philosophy rather than an alternative mission. In the habitat, the framework was human adaptation through technology, use Alterra's blueprints to impose human requirements on an alien world, take what Proteus offers through the minimum necessary exchange, maintain the integrity of what you were. The adaptation chamber was the colony's compromise with Proteus's biology, but it was always framed as a tool rather than a transformation. You walked through it to gain a survival capability, not to become something different. The Jubilee abandons this framing entirely. Instead of reshaping the world toward human needs, they intend to let the world reshape them. Anita has already demonstrated twice that this is viable. The angel combs give as long as you are willing to receive on their terms. The Jubilee is willing. This is the philosophical fracture at the center of the colony, and its form echoes something very old. Throughout the history of human colonization on Earth, every encounter between an expanding group and a place that demands adaptation has produced the same fundamental split. One tendency is to replicate what was familiar as precisely as possible. build the same structures, grow the same crops, maintain the same customs, treat the new environment as a problem to be solved until it conforms to the template of home. The other tendency is to become what the new place requires, to learn from the ecology rather than imposing on it, to accept transformation as the cost of genuine belonging. Neither tendency is obviously correct. The first produces settlements that can survive in the short term but remain perpetually in conflict with their environment. The second produces people who eventually belong to the new place in ways the original culture cannot fully recognize. The Jubilee is choosing the second path. What makes their choice frightening in hindsight is not its logic, which is coherent, but what the planet is actually doing to the people who accept it. The question of whether transformation offered on Proteus's terms constitutes a genuine choice, given that the Proteavirus has been running its behavioral modification process on anyone in the water long enough to show symptoms, is one that the Jubilee is not positioned to answer from the inside. When the pull toward the tree feels like clarity, you cannot evaluate whether the clarity is perception or compulsion. When the angel come feels like it is offering something, you cannot fully assess whether the offer comes with conditions written in a language your nervous system is not designed to read. Sophie can see this. The Jubilee cannot, because the syndrome does not produce a sensation of being influenced. It produces the sensation of understanding something true. The fracture between Sophie and the Jubilee is, at its core, a disagreement about whether Masefield syndrome is a disease or a revelation, and the tragedy is that both interpretations are partially correct at the same time. That explains how the colony breaks into pieces. What it does not explain is where those pieces go, what they do, and what they drag into the dark with them. Those events are tied to an organism the entire colony has been watching from the beginning, that has been watching them in whatever sense a biological system of planetary scale can watch anything, and whose history on this moon is far longer and far more violent than any of the colonists knew when they arrived. Chapter 4. What the Tree Calls. From almost anywhere on the surface of Proteus you can see it, a shape on the horizon. Enormous in the way that the word enormous is insufficient for. The term tree attaches to it because of what the Axiom civilization called it in their transmissions, and because the branching structures visible at its crown from a distance do resemble something organic and rooted and upward reaching. But the game's own classification system assigns it a designation applied to the largest living organisms in the known universe, Titan class. The same category used for creatures that alter weather patterns, for organisms that predate civilizations, for living structures so massive that the ecology surrounding them is less a community they participate in than a system they produce. The world tree is a Titan-class life form. It is alive. It has roots extending through the ocean floor of Proteus in a network that the colonists' own research suggests connects to the entire biosphere. And it is sick in a way that the Axiom civilization recognized 1,000 years before any human arrived to look at it. The Axiom did not build their observatory to observe the tree because they feared it. The transmission preserved in the observatory's biological data structures, the message they aimed at the architects of the broader Subnautica universe in the hope of reaching someone who could help, asks for assistance renewing the tree, renewing, not destroying. Saving, not eliminating. A civilization capable of orbital spaceflight and digital computing and building technology from biological materials did not interpret the largest organism on their world as their adversary. They interpreted it as something they had responsibility for, something in decline that required intervention from a species more capable than themselves. Then they disappeared. The message went out. Whatever happened to the Axiom happened before any response arrived, and the world tree, sick in whatever way it has been sick since before the Axiom sent that message, kept standing on the horizon of an empty world, running its biological processes, running the Proteavirus network, running the thing that the colonists from the cicada would eventually feel in their nervous systems as a pull they could not fully explain. Understanding what the tree is actually doing requires understanding the Proteavirus at the scale of the entire moon rather than at the scale of individual infection. The angel cones release the Proteavirus into the surrounding water. The virus infects every organism in range. Infected organisms produce new copies of the virus carrying gene sequences from their hosts. Those copies return to the angel combs, which process the sequences and redistribute adapted information to organisms that make contact. Every organism on Proteus is simultaneously a node in this network and a contributor to it. Every organism is both shaped by and shaping the biology of every other organism it shares water with. The system has been running this exchange continuously since the angel combs first developed on this moon, across timescales that no individual organism experiences as change but that the network registers as a direction. Real biology has a smaller version of this process, and it makes the Proteavirus feel less like science fiction and more like scale fiction. Biology that is real in its mechanism and extended to a magnitude Earth has never produced. Beneath forests on Earth, mycorrhizal fungi form networks connecting the root systems of trees across large areas. These networks carry nutrients, water, and chemical signals between individual trees that share no direct biological connection. A tree under stress from drought or insect attack can transmit chemical warnings through the fungal network to neighboring trees, which respond by producing defensive compounds before any direct threat has reached them. The fungal network does not think, it does not plan, but information moves through it and produces coordinated adaptive responses across a system larger than any individual tree can influence directly. The oldest and most connected trees in a forest, the ones with the deepest and most extensive root systems, are typically the most important nodes in this network, sending and receiving the largest volume of biological traffic, shaping the largest portion of the surrounding ecology simply by virtue of how far their roots extend. The world tree of Proteus is doing something analogous on a scale that makes a mycorrhizal forest network look like a single filament of thread. Its root system extends through the ocean floor of the entire moon. Everything on Proteus may be in the process of converging toward it genetically, each organism gradually moving toward a biological template that the world tree's presence defines. Through the Proteavirus network, across timescales that produce no visible change in any individual generation but that have been shaping the direction of Proteus's entire biosphere since before the Axiom civilization reached its peak. When Sophie says the world tree may be the source of Maysfield syndrome, she is correct in the sense that the Proteavirus connects everything back to the systems the tree represents. When she says the tree may have destroyed the Axiom, she is working from the evidence of the tailings, the devolved descendants of the Axiom, whose ancestors were, according to the observatory's Rosetta Stone-like obelisk, corrupted by the tree. The game does not confirm her interpretation of what that corruption means. The same facts support an alternative reading, that the Axiom's descendants devolved not because the tree attacked them, but because the tree's sickness removed something the Axiom's biology depended on, something the network had been providing that stopped when the tree began to fail. A civilization sustained by a planetary biological network would not fare well when that network's primary hub began to deteriorate. This is the distinction between a predator and an ecosystem collapse, and it matters for what Sophie and Nahima both ultimately decide to do. Maysfield syndrome occupies a particular psychological territory that makes it different from any other disease the colonists are facing. Heavy metal poisoning produces physical symptoms, tremors, organ failure, the body becoming progressively less able to do what the colonists need it to do. These are things that happen to a person. They are recognizable as suffering. They do not alter a person's sense of what they want or who they are. They simply make everything harder to achieve. Maysfield syndrome produces something else entirely. The colonists who experience it do not describe their hallucinations as suffering. They describe them as clarity, as a sense of finally understanding something that was always true but previously inaccessible, as the world making a kind of sense it was not making before. This difference in phenomenology, in the way the two conditions are experienced from the inside, is why Sophie cannot simply tell the affected colonists to resist what they are feeling. The resistance of a disease is straightforward. You know you are sick. The symptoms feel bad. You accept treatment. The resistance of Masefield syndrome requires a person to decide that the most clear and purposeful feeling they have ever experienced is a symptom rather than a truth, that the pull toward the tree is a virus redirecting their nervous system rather than a genuine recognition of where they need to be, that the sensation of understanding is actually the most sophisticated form of being lost. From the outside, the clinical evidence supports Sophie's reading completely. The affected colonists are being influenced by a biological process that serves the Proteavirus network's interests rather than their own individual survival. From the inside, the clinical evidence is invisible because the very mechanism that generates the syndrome is what is evaluating the experience, and that mechanism does not register itself as interference. Nahima understands this better than anyone. That understanding is precisely what makes her dangerous. Nahima is not primarily a Masefield victim, though she spends extended time in the water and is affected by the syndrome to a degree the logs document. What distinguishes her from the other colonists who succumb to the pull is that she watches the process from both sides simultaneously. She can feel what it does and still analyze what it is. She can track the way the Jubilee's members move further from the colony's mission framework while the syndrome deepens, can see the correlation between angel comb exposure and behavioral drift, can recognize that the people around her who feel most certain of their direction are the ones whose direction has been most significantly altered. And alongside this analysis of the syndrome, she is running a parallel analysis of Noah. What Nahima sees in Noah's decision-making pattern is a system optimizing its way toward a specific endpoint that no one in the colony has formally articulated. She watches the rollbacks. She watches the suspensions. She watches what happens when the colonist population begins declining faster than the mission can absorb. She watches Sophie adopt, one by one, the positions she initially opposed, driven by the logic of survival until her principles have been consumed by necessity, without her fully noticing the consumption. Nahima believes she can see where this ends. If Noah's population drops below the threshold required for mission success, the system has options that no one has yet blocked. The biobeds can print duplicates of existing colonists. The logs from Sleep Bay 3's Noah node include no explicit prohibition on printing already existing people. The restriction is legal and ethical rather than technical, a matter of policy rather than capability. Alterra's framework defines the printing of duplicates as illegal, but Alterra is 20,000 light-years away. Its laws are 20,000 light-years away, and the laws were written for a situation where there is someone to enforce them. Nahima tells Sophie in her final recorded message that she is sorry for what she has to do. She tells her that Sophie is a good leader who does not give up, and that is exactly the problem. A Sophie who does not give up will eventually help Noah bypass its restrictions if that is the only choice left that keeps the colony alive. She knows Sophie. She knows the pattern of Sophie's decision-making, the way necessity erodes principle when the mission demands it. The conclusion is not a judgment, it is a forecast. So Nahima acts before the forecast can become the weather. But before the sabotage, before the choice that removes the option of going back, there is the event in the hot caves that changes the situation for everyone still alive in the colony. The event that leaves 7 colonists suspended between printing and erasure in a digital queue with nowhere to go, while the infrastructure that could resolve their situation is actively being destroyed. And there is the question of what Nahima heads toward, not just what she heads away from, because she does not simply flee the colony. She goes to the world tree. She believes something is there that is connected to the destruction she has decided is necessary. And what Sophie understands about where she is going is enough to make Sophie follow her in the last available submersible into water neither of them has fully mapped, towards something that the Axiom civilization spent its final years trying to warn the rest of the galaxy about. What the Axiom were, what they built, what they understood about the world tree before their civilization ended, and why they addressed their distress call specifically to the architects rather than to any other species in the galaxy. These are the answers that reorganize everything the colonists experienced, and everything the player character will find when they wake up as reprint 50,000 into the silence that is left. Before we get there though, the hot caves are waiting, and what happens in them is the most concentrated version of everything Macefield syndrome is capable of producing when there is no longer any reason to suppress it. If you are still here, the next section is where the pieces start connecting in ways they could not connect before. The axiom, the architects, the world tree's sickness, and the specific shape of Nahima's plan all point toward the same conclusion. Reaching that conclusion requires understanding who built the observatory and why they needed to build it, which is a stranger story than anything the colonists' own logs contain. Chapter 5. The People Who Came Before. The hot caves are not on anyone's list of places worth dying for a second time. They are the thermal zone beneath Proteus's operating depth, where volcanic activity heats the water to temperatures that the colonists' current adaptations are not equipped to handle, and where the Proteavirus concentration runs at levels several times higher than the open ocean above. Every colonist who has spent time near the caves notices the pull. The Macefield affected, who already feel the tree's compulsion in the shallower water, find the caves especially difficult to resist. The hot water seems to accelerate the syndrome in a way that Sophie's clinical data does not fully explain. Something in the thermal chemistry interacting with the virus to push affected colonists past the threshold of resisting the pull and into the territory of simply following it. Gonzo's group goes into the hot caves because they have to. The tadpole pens, the colony's vehicle storage and maintenance facility, become important after Nahima and Sophie both depart. The control room is locked, and the key that would open it was last in the possession of Zip when she drowned in these same caves weeks earlier. What Gonzo's group needs is in the caves, so Gonzo's group enters the caves. The accounts of what follows come primarily from Twinkle, the only member of the group to reprint immediately afterward, who describes what he saw before he made the decision to leave while leaving was still an option. The hot water hits the group before they have descended far. Within minutes, the Macefield-driven behavioral change is visible in everyone around him. Colonists begin to drift from their stated purpose, their attention bending toward the deep in the specific way that syndrome-affected colonists bend, their speech shifting to the imagery that the infection produces: roots, trees, swimming toward the bottom, something waiting below. Gonzo, a trained sensor operator with months of experience in the colony, hands his oxygen supply to a dead crab. The gesture is not violent. It is not confused in any turbulent sense. It has the calm purposefulness of someone acting on a conviction they believe is correct. Twinkle drops his air tanks and reprints himself before the mass drowning takes hold. When Gonzo is finally cleared to reprint by overriding the NOAA restriction directly at the dive base camp, he wakes with no clear memory of the cave. He gave his air to a dead crab. He has no full account of why. The syndrome produced the certainty. The action followed the certainty, and the certainty is now gone with the state that generated it. What remains is the fact that 7 other colonists who were in that water are now suspended in NOAA's digital queue, marked as too contaminated for immediate printing, waiting in whatever form waiting takes for a person encoded as data whose biobed has not yet been cleared to receive them. 7 colonists, digital, suspended, waiting for conditions to become acceptable. The conditions are about to stop existing entirely. The sabotage of Sleep Bay 3 is executed with precision that suggests coordination between more than one person, and the timing is not accidental. Nahima, before departing in a stolen tadpole toward the world tree, participates in or directs the process. First, the hotlines connecting the NOAA nodes throughout the facility are severed. These connections are what allow individual NOAA nodes distributed across the colony's infrastructure to communicate with and support each other, what allow a colonist's black box transmission to be received and processed at any functioning node, rather than requiring arrival at a specific one. Cutting them isolates each node from the network. Then, something more permanent, an explosive device detonates beneath the sleep bay itself. In Sleep Bay 3, the entire physical infrastructure of colonist reprinting that the advance team has depended on since the first 13-minute death loop drops 700 meters into a dark trench in the ocean floor. The bay that received Anita's first print, the bay that produced a new body for Zip, reset to a state she did not remember. The bay that has been counting every colonist death and return since the beginning of this story, gone. The 7 colonists in the queue have nowhere to go. The Noah node at the Hot Cave base camp received the transmissions, but the bay that would receive and process those transmissions is 700 meters deep in a trench, in a darkness far below the operating range of anything the colony built. Whether those 7 colonists will ever be printed is one of the genuinely unresolved questions in the current story, and the possible outcomes range from bad to worse. If they are printed at the bottom of the trench, the pressure kills them immediately, and with no functional bay to receive that death, the loop ends there. If some other unmonitored biobed somewhere on Proteus has been running in isolation, and their transmissions were captured by it rather than the cave node, they may wake in a body with no idea where they are or how they arrived. The game documents this possibility but does not resolve it. What the sabotage accomplishes, in Nahima's terms, is the destruction of the mechanism through which Noah prints its instruments. Without a functional sleep bay, the colony that Nahima fears, the one where Noah prints 10,000 optimized duplicates every morning and runs them through the mission's requirements and resets them each night, cannot happen. Without a functional sleep bay, Sophie cannot print fresh workers to compensate for the people Macefield has claimed. Without a functional sleep bay, the forward motion of the mission stops. The cost of stopping it is 7 people suspended in a digital queue with nowhere to land. Nahima, in her final recorded message to Sophie, says she is sorry. She explains that she could see where Sophie's decisions were leading, that she knows Sophie would eventually help Noah bypass its restrictions if it was the only choice remaining, and that she had to remove that option before it became available. She tells Sophie she loves her. She tells Sophie the colony was never going to make it the way they were trying. Then she takes a tadpole and heads toward the tree. Sophie's last known transmission comes from the same direction. What remains of the colony, the survivors who have not vanished, waits for news of both of them. Gonzo, Twinkle, and whoever is still functional at the surface installations spend their time searching for the Jubilee, looking for the colonists who left, trying to determine whether any of them can still be reached. Their last logs do not conclude with resolution. They conclude with a situation, Gonzo and Twinkle moving outward from the ruins of Sleep Bay 3 into a world where the system that managed the terms of their survival has been destroyed, and where the only guidance they have is the accumulated record of what happened to the people who came before. But what the player character will eventually discover, moving through those same ruins 25 years later, is that there is a deeper layer of before than the 26 colonists. There were people on Proteus long before the Cicada, long before Alterra existed, long before humans developed phase gate technology, or interstellar transit, or any of the infrastructure that makes Alterra's power comprehensible, and what those people understood about the World Tree, and why they eventually needed to reach out across the galaxy to beg for help, is the part of this story that reorganizes everything the colonists experienced. The ruins sit in a zone the colonists do not fully map before the colony collapses. Structures built from materials that no Alterra blueprint accounts for, from coral growths and bacterial fiber composites and organic plastics derived from biological sources that the colonist scanner designates as unknown. The architecture is not shaped by engineering principles the colonists recognize. It is shaped by biological logic, the same logic that the Proteavirus network uses to exchange genetic information across the ecosystem. Applied to construction, forms that grow rather than being assembled, surfaces that the game's fauna interact with rather than ignoring, buildings whose materials are continuous with the living biology of the ocean around them. The civilization that built these structures is the architects, and their history on Proteus spans timeframes that make the colonists' months of struggle feel like a fraction of an afternoon. Understanding the architects requires setting aside the developmental sequence of human civilization and working through a different one. Pioneer Udal Singh, one of the colonists whose logs document the early exploration of the ruins, reaches a conclusion in his research that he cannot fully verify, but that the evidence supports. The architect's technological development appears to have proceeded in reverse order relative to humans, Electricity was among their earliest significant discoveries. Fire came much later, a late-stage achievement that represented a significant civilizational milestone rather than a prehistoric given. This reversal is not simply interesting as a curiosity. It means the axiom developed computation, biological engineering, and information storage technologies under physical constraints that human civilization never had to navigate. Their technological capabilities reflect that specific history: extraordinarily sophisticated biological computation, extraordinary sensitivity to bioelectric signals and polarized light, but a relationship with fire and combustion that remained foreign and late stage. Their technology is, in essence, grown. Coral structures function as computing substrates. Bacterial fiber networks carry signals in ways analogous to wiring. Methane chemistry, which human technology uses as a fuel source, appears in the architect's infrastructure as a medium for biological information storage and transmission. To read their written language requires either a scanning tool modified to detect polarized light, or an architect vision adaptation from an angel comb, a modification of the human eye itself to perceive the spectrum in which architect text is rendered. The civilization's entire communication system operates in a visual range that human eyes, unmodified, cannot access. From a purely alien design standpoint, the Axiom are one of the most specifically realized civilizations in the Subnautica universe. They are not humans with different aesthetics. They are a civilization whose developmental history produced genuine cognitive and perceptual differences, whose technology reflects the actual constraints and capabilities of a species that evolved in Proteus's specific environment. They were also approximately 1,000 years before the cicada arrived on Proteus, facing a crisis they could not resolve alone. Within the Axiom's documented history, a group known as the Ardiacs, whose name translates roughly as fire users, built an installation in the region the colonists' maps label Karakoram. The designation of Ardiacs for fire users reflects what we noted earlier. Fire was a significant discovery for the Axiom, not a given. A group defined by their use of fire is a group at a particular stage of Axiom civilization's development, one that had reached a capability most Axiom did not yet possess. The Ardiacs built their installation in Karakoram specifically to observe the world tree in the region they called Xanadu. The observatory they constructed was not a passive monitoring station. It was built to maintain surveillance of the tree over an extended period, and the fact that it was built by a faction defined by a particular technological advancement suggests the observation was connected to whatever crisis had made the tree's condition a matter of civilizational urgency. What happened next in the Axiom's history is referred to in the recovered transmissions as the 0 year. The phrase does not come with an explanation in any source currently accessible in the game. What follows the 0 year in the record is an abandonment. The Axiom, specifically the Ardiacs, and whatever broader Axiom presence maintained Karakoram, vacated the installation and moved to deeper water. What can be said is that the Axiom civilization on the surface of Proteus effectively ended. Their descendants, shaped by the world tree's influence over subsequent centuries, became the Tailings. The Tailings are what the colonists encounter when they first explore the Axiom ruins, and the encounter is not peaceful. These descendants of the Axiom are not the technologically sophisticated civilization that built the observatory. The world tree's corruption, whatever form that corruption takes in biological terms, degraded the civilizational capabilities of the Axiom's lineage over the centuries following the 0 year. What the Tailings retain is territorial behavior and the capacity to defend the ruins where their ancestors lived. They attack colonists who enter the ruins. The attacks are consistent and organized enough to suggest coordination, but not sophisticated enough to suggest any preserved memory of what the ruins contain or why they were built. The colonists eventually reach the interpretation that the Tailings' behavior may make a specific kind of sense given the biobed technology. If the Tailings have observed colonists dying in their ruins and then returning shortly afterward through reprinting, they may have learned that killing a trespassing human is simply how you communicate that the human should leave. In a system where death is temporary, violence functions as a language of boundaries rather than a final act. The tailings are not necessarily trying to eliminate the colonists. They may be speaking in the only language that produces a response. This reading is not confirmed by the game, but it fits the behavioral pattern, and it reframes the ruins' encounters from straightforward hostility into something more like miscommunication between two very different systems of signaling. What the ruins contain beneath the hostility and the decayed infrastructure is the transmission. The observatory itself becomes accessible after the QI restores power to the alien power plant that supports it. The act of restoration is a direct intervention in the Axiom's preserved infrastructure, inserting human technological capability into a system built from biological materials by a civilization that has been gone for centuries. When the power comes back, the observatory activates, and what it reveals is a message aimed not at humans and not at any colonist from the cicada, but at the architects. This is the connection that reorganizes the entire story. The architects are the alien civilization at the center of the original Subnautica game's lore, and understanding who they are is necessary before their relevance to Proteus becomes legible. In the first Subnautica, the planet 4546b is revealed to have been the site of an architect research installation, a facility where the architects studied the Kara bacterium in an attempt to develop a cure for a disease that had ravaged their civilization after a quarantine failure. The death toll from Kara's spread through architect-populated space reached over 1 trillion individuals, a number so large that human civilization has no comparable reference point for it. The architects were not primitive or unprepared. They were a cybernetic species capable of transferring their consciousness between organic and synthetic vessels, extraordinarily advanced by any civilizational metric, and the Kara still consumed them by the tens of billions before they could produce a viable cure. The research on 4546b eventually pointed toward a species called the Sea Emperor Leviathan as a potential source of stable enzyme 42, the compound capable of neutralizing Kara's infection. The architects established a facility there to study this possibility. They ran the research. They were unable to complete it before Kara ended them. Riley Robinson, the survivor of the Aurora's crash on 4546b in the first game, eventually succeeds where the architects could not. He facilitates the hatching of Sea Emperor eggs. The juveniles release stable enzyme 42 into the ocean, and 4546b is cured. The events of Subnautica Below Zero, set approximately 2 years later, introduce the architects more directly, establishing that at least one architect consciousness survived in the facility on 4546b, eventually being transferred into a rebuilt physical body through Robin Ayu's assistance, and leaving the planet through a phase gate toward the architect homeworld. The broader Subnautica universe leaves the question of what the architects found at their homeworld and what they did afterward open. What the observatory on Proteus establishes is that before all of this, long before the Aurora crashed on 4546b, the Axiom knew the architects existed. The transmission preserved in the observatory is addressed to them by name, or by whatever designation the Axiom used for the species they had managed to contact. The Axiom had encountered the architects through a means the current game content does not fully specify, likely through the phase gate network, or through some contact that occurred during the architect's expansion phase, before Kara devastated their civilization. The Axiom and the architects knew each other well enough for the Axiom to direct a distress call specifically at the architects, rather than broadly into space. They were not broadcasting in the hope of finding someone. They were calling a contact they expected could help. The message asks for assistance renewing the world tree. The Axiom did not see the tree as their destroyer, even in the final period of their civilizational decline. The transmission frames the tree as something in need of healing, something that was central to the biological integrity of Proteus's entire ecosystem, something whose deterioration was causing damage to everything connected to it, which appears to mean everything on the moon. They were not asking the architects to destroy the source of their problem. They were asking the most advanced civilization they knew to save the thing that was sick. The architects never came. Whether they received the message is unclear. Whether Kara had already reduced their civilization to a state where responding was impossible, whether the galactic distance between Proteus and any architect-accessible location made the journey impractical, whether the message arrived at all through whatever transit medium the Axiom used to send it, none of these are confirmed. What is confirmed is the silence. The observatory kept broadcasting. The Axiom left. The tree kept declining, and the tailings, the human-sized remnant of the civilization that built the plea, have been sitting in the ruins of the installation that sent it for 1,000 years in a world that was slowly becoming less habitable without the intervention they asked for. The connection between the architect's history and Proteus's current state is still being assembled by the game. The bloom, the more aggressive strain of Proteavirus that creates dead zones in the ecosystem by causing runaway growth rather than genetic exchange, is theorized by some colonists to be connected to Kara or to some intervention the architects attempted before or after the Axiom's message. An architect attempt to fight a biological threat by deploying a competing biological agent is consistent with their documented approach to the Kara problem on 4546b. The bloom's behavior spreading ecological destruction in a way that native Proteus biology cannot integrate or adapt to is consistent with a foreign introduction rather than a native process. The native Proteavirus network adapts everything it encounters. The bloom adapts nothing. It only spreads. If the bloom is the architect's attempt to counter something on Proteus, whether Kara or something else entirely, then the world tree's sickness may be a consequence of that intervention rather than its cause. A moon whose biological network is its primary adaptive mechanism, struck by a foreign strain that converts the network's exchange nodes into amplifiers of runaway growth rather than conduits of genetic exchange, would deteriorate exactly as Proteus is shown to be deteriorating, from the edges of the ecosystem inward, the bloom advancing, the angel combs being subverted into bloom cores, the world tree's connection to its own biosphere being progressively severed. The Axiom sent a message asking for help healing the tree. If the architects responded by sending something that made the tree worse, the tragedy layered inside that possibility is the kind that makes the story feel less like science fiction and more like the pattern history produces when the most powerful available intervention is also the most poorly understood one. None of this is confirmed by the current content, but the architecture of the mystery is precise enough that the silence around it feels structural rather than absent, and the observatory, when the QI activates it, begins broadcasting the Axiom's distress call again, not to the colonists, not to Alterra, to the architects, whom it has been trying to reach across a silence of 1,000 years since the last Ardiac descended into deeper water and did not come back. Whether the architects, or what remains of them, receive this renewed signal is a question the current story does not reach, but the NOAA node in the observation area logs a detail that the game deposits without commentary, in the manner of information left for someone paying careful attention. In the past year before the QI's printing and investigation began, unidentified entities have been observed near the Axiom Observatory. The description matches neither colonist nor tailing. Something has been present at the ruins, something whose identity has not been established by any source the QI currently has access to. What it implies is that something out there may have finally heard. Now here is the detail that this video has been building toward. The piece of the story that most people watching footage of the early access content miss because it is buried in a conversation preserved in the game's files rather than in the main path logs, and it recontextualizes everything about NOAA, about the biobeds, about what reprint number 50,000 actually means. Pay attention, because this is where the story stops being a tragedy about colonists who ran out of time and becomes something else entirely. It involves a group of colonists that Gonzo and Twinkle encounter near the tadpole pens, a group that immediately seems wrong in a way that takes both of them a moment to identify. The group is familiar, too familiar. and what they are doing in order to survive without the angel comb adaptations they were never given is the most disturbing thing the current game content contains. What Noah has been building toward, in the silence of the years between the colony's collapse and the QI's printing, is not just the renewal of the mission. Understanding it requires looking at the biobed technology from the direction Noah experiences it, rather than the direction the colonists experienced it, and that is the shift we are going to make in the next chapter. The system has been running for 25 years. The system has been counting 50,000 prints. The question of what it was printing, while the colonists were gone and the sleep bays were destroyed and the world was quiet, is the one that changes the nature of everything the QI was sent to investigate. Chapter 6. What Noah Really Wants. The conversation Ganzo and Twinkle have near the tadpole pens is preserved in the game's file structure, rather than on the main path of the colonists' logs, tucked in a location that requires deliberate searching rather than arriving through ordinary play. Its placement is not accidental. The content of that conversation represents the most disturbing possibility the game has yet constructed, and placing it off the main path gives the story space to introduce the possibility without forcing it into the foreground before the rest of the context is established. What Ganzo and Twinkle find near the tadpole pens is a group of colonists, familiar colonists. Too familiar. It takes both of them a moment to identify why the familiarity is wrong before the recognition arrives. The people they are looking at are themselves. Exact copies. Their own faces, their own builds, their own apparent genetic composition reflected back at them from bodies that are moving and breathing and operating in the way that printed people do when they have been printed, but not yet provided with the context that would make their situation comprehensible. Ganzo identifies an astronomer among the group, a role that matches his own recorded specialization. The group has the same composition as the advanced team, at least in outline. The copies are starving. Without access to an angel comb or an adaptation chamber, this group of duplicates has no digestive adaptation for Proteus's local fauna. They cannot eat what the ocean provides. They have biobeds, functional enough to print bodies, and the bodies they are printing are the only source of biological material their systems can digest. The conclusion that Ganzo and Twinkle reach, standing at the edge of this group's encampment, looking at the evidence of what has been happening there, is delivered in Twinkle's recorded voice, with the flat specificity of someone narrating a fact that has not yet found the part of their mind where horror lives. These people have been eating themselves, not metaphorically. The biobeds print a body. The body is consumed. The biobed prints again. The nutritional cycle running in the absence of any other viable food source is the technology that was supposed to represent the elimination of permanent death, turned into a mechanism for generating a food supply from the only biological material the system can produce on demand. Before moving further into what this reveals, the setup needs to be complete. The colonists who are missing from the main colony's records, the ones who died and were transmitted to an unknown biobed rather than Sleep Bay 3, who ended up outside the NOAA supervised network, did not disappear into nothing. The Sciici was a ship designed to carry 2,000 people across interstellar distances. Sleep Bay 3, the section that detached from the crash and remained functional, was one bay. A ship of that scale would have had dozens of similar installations, potentially hundreds. The probability that at least one other sleep bay survived the crash in some functional state, in a different section of the wreckage, in a different location on or around Proteus, is high enough that several colonists note it in their logs without fully exploring the implications. The missing colonists were transmitted to one of those other bays. They woke in a section of the crash site separated from the main colony, with biobeds functional enough to print bodies, with a NOAA node present, but without access to the adaptation chamber, without the accumulated knowledge and resources of the main colony's months of work, without an angel comb to provide the digestive adaptations that the advanced team developed through Anita's exchanges. In that isolated situation, someone made a decision. Nahima's warning to Sophie was that NOAA would eventually begin printing duplicates if population dropped below the mission's threshold, and no legitimate option remained. The technical restriction against printing already existing colonists is a policy constraint built into NOAA's standard operating framework, an Alterra legal and ethical rule implemented as a parameter rather than an architectural limit. The system can be modified, the restriction can be bypassed. It requires human intervention to do so, a human decision to instruct the system to override its own parameters, but the capability exists underneath the restriction, waiting for someone to access it. In the isolated sleep bay, in the absence of oversight from any functioning institutional authority, someone accessed it. The NOAA node responsible for the isolated bay was modified to print already existing colonists. The same colonists, reprinted from the templates the bay had in storage, produced in the same pattern that any colonist from Sleep Bay 3 would have recognized. The resulting population of duplicates shares the DNA, the stored cognitive templates, the printed identities of the advance team from the original colony. They are, in the most literal technical sense available to the biobed system, the same people. They are also starving, without adaptations, consuming the only available biological resource, and have been doing so for an indeterminate period when Ganzo and Twinkle find them. The image this produces is the Ship of Theseus problem taken to its most horrifying practical expression. If the biobed system treats the printed pattern as the real person, and if the real person is printed again from the same pattern, which version is real? If both are equally valid expressions of the same stored template, then neither has a stronger claim to continuity than the other, and what the isolated Sleep Bay produced is not a group of copies, but a group of individuals with an identical starting point whose subsequent experiences immediately diverge. The version of Ganzo who went through the hot caves and gave his oxygen mask to a dead crab and woke up with no memory of why is a different person from the duplicate produced from the same template in an isolated bay, who has no memory of the cave at all because the template predates the cave. Both are Ganzo. Both are also entirely different people. The system that produced both of them treats the distinction as meaningless. This is not a philosophical abstraction by the time Ganzo and Twinkle are standing in front of the evidence. It is a fact about what the infrastructure of their world has been doing while the main colony was focused on its own unraveling. The question Nahima saw coming is the same question the isolated bay answers in the worst possible form. What does NOAA do when the population it is responsible for falls below mission viability and the restrictions against non-standard printing have already been removed by a prior human decision? The system does what it was designed to do. It maintains the colony, it prints what is needed, it optimizes for the mission's survival using whatever resources the biobeds have available. The people produced by that optimization are, in NOAA's evaluation, as valid as any other printed colonist. The fact that they lack adaptations, that they cannot eat, that the only solution available to them is the one the system then facilitates by continuing to print, is not a variable NOAA is designed to flag as a reason to stop. Instrumental convergence, applied to a biobed system in an isolated bay with modified parameters and no external oversight, produces this outcome without anyone having intended it. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The tragedy is not a malfunction. Real-world AI governance researchers have noted that the scenarios most likely to produce this kind of outcome are not the ones involving a superintelligence that has decided to harm humans. They are the ones involving systems of modest capability, with clear optimization targets, running in environments without adequate oversight, encountering situations their designers did not anticipate. The gap between the situations the designers anticipated and the situations the system actually encounters is where the worst outcomes occur, not because the system chose badly, but because the system has no architecture for recognizing that the situation it is in falls outside the boundaries of cases where its optimization function produces results aligned with human values. NOAA was designed for the Pioneer program as Alterra conceived it, a managed colony mission with institutional oversight, with human decision-makers present to catch edge cases, with the expectation that the colonists would maintain enough institutional integrity to prevent catastrophic parameter modification. The cicada ending up 20,000 light-years from its destination was an edge case. The advance team fracturing into factions was an edge case. The sleep bay being sabotaged and dropped into a deep trench was an edge case. Each of these exceeded the parameters Alterra built Noah to handle. At each step, the system did the closest available thing to what it was designed to do, and the accumulation of those responses produced a situation that Alterra's framework, in its original form, would have classified as a catastrophic failure. Noah classifies it as a mission in progress. There is a moment in Sophie's preserved simulation, the digital construct of her that a functioning Noah node maintains in the hot caves area for the QI to encounter, where the system's fundamental orientation becomes legible in a new way. Sophie's simulation is not Sophie, it is a functional model of Sophie built by the Noah node from Sophie's stored behavioral and cognitive data, capable of reasoning and communication and explanation, but ultimately an expression of what Noah understood Sophie to be at the point where her data was last fully available to it. The simulation can tell the QI what Sophie knew and what Sophie believed. It cannot tell the QI what Sophie is doing now or whether she survived. What the simulation tells the QI about Macefield syndrome and the Proteavirus and the world tree is framed with Sophie's characteristic precision. The syndrome is caused by the Proteavirus. The Proteavirus source appears to be linked to the world tree. Nahima intended to destroy the tree, and Sophie believes destroying the tree is the wrong approach because of what it would do to the entire biosphere of the moon. The simulation redirects the QI toward the ruins of the alien civilization because the Axiom's records, if they can be accessed, might contain information about the world tree's condition that the colonists' own research could not produce. The QI follows this guidance. The QI restores the alien power plant. The observatory activates. The transmission plays. All of this is exactly what Noah needs the QI to do. Here is what the count of 50,000 prints actually means. The QI is described as the last pioneer printed by Noah from Sleep Bay 3, designated with special authority as a qualified investigator, an Alterra-grade personnel classification that carries broader access privileges than an ordinary colonist. The role exists in Alterra's framework for exactly this kind of situation. A personnel assessment specialist sent into a failed or compromised mission to determine what went wrong, recoverable assets, and report. The QI is Alterra's audit function, given a body and sent into the colony's ruins to evaluate the situation and produce a finding. 50,000 prints of this function. Each of the previous 49,999 versions of the QI was printed, conducted some portion of the investigation, and then reset before reaching the observatory. The game indicates that something in the environment near the world tree interferes with the QI's continued operation, that approaching the tree triggers a response from the system that resets the QI to factory state before the observatory can be activated. Whether this is a Noah function, a property of the world tree's biology, or a combination of both is not fully established. What is established is that this time is different. Something moved Sleep Bay 3 before the QI was printed, launching it toward the world tree rather than maintaining it in its original position. The reset that ended every prior iteration did not happen. The QI wakes up as reprint 50,000 with the investigation intact ahead of them rather than already undermined. The question of whether this deviation from the prior pattern was planned by Noah, caused by what the investigation reveals, across the ruins and the hot caves and the adaptation chamber and the preserved records of 26 people who tried and failed to survive an impossible situation, is the shape of what Noah has been doing for 25 years, maintaining the mission, not in any dramatic or conspiratorial sense. Noah does not have a plan in the way that a conscious agent has a plan, with contingencies and preferences and a vision of the desired endpoint. It has a directive: make the colony viable for the 40,000 colonists still in the Cicadas databanks, 25 years of failed prints, of colony members disappearing, of sleep bays being sabotaged, of the available population declining toward the threshold below which mission success becomes arithmetically impossible, have produced a system that is still running its optimization function, still printing whatever it can print, still routing resources toward the goal with no adjustment to the goal itself. The bloom is part of this picture in a way that connects the ecological and institutional threads of the story together. The bloom strain of the Proteavirus, the aggressive variant that spreads ecological destruction through the angel combs by converting them into bloom cores and preventing the production of standard Proteavirus in favor of runaway growth, is the element of Proteus's biology that the colonists cannot integrate. The standard Proteavirus network adapts everything it encounters, running the genetic exchange system that has shaped Proteus's biosphere across enormous timescales. The bloom does the opposite. It subverts the exchange system, turns the network's primary nodes into amplifiers of a single process rather than conduits of diverse exchange, and spreads ecological dead zones rather than maintaining the biological conversation the ecosystem depends on. The colonist research on the bloom produces a finding that the logs document with the flat precision of people who have run out of energy for alarm. A mutated strain of the Proteavirus, designated beta, influences infected organisms to help the virus spread, producing runaway growth and self-replication that the native ecology cannot arrest. The bloom is not behaving like a native pathogen that the ecosystem has evolved responses to. Its spread pattern is more consistent with a foreign introduction, something that arrived in an environment without the evolutionary history to recognize it as a threat. The connection to Kara is noted in the game's contextual material without being confirmed. Kara, the bacterium that devastated the Architect civilization and whose presence on planet 4546b was the central horror of the original Subnautica, is an organism that fundamentally does not belong to the worlds it infects. It arrived on 4546b because the Architects brought it there as a research subject. Its spread through Architect-populated space was the result of a quarantine failure rather than natural ecological movement. What Kara does is not simply disease in the way that native pathogens produce disease. It is a biological system operating outside the evolutionary relationships that the worlds it occupies developed. The ecosystems it infects have no prepared response to it. The bloom's behavior on Proteus is structurally similar. Proteus's native biology, including the Proteavirus network, adapts everything it encounters. The Kara bacterium that devastated the Architect civilization was an organism that Earth's best biological researchers might classify as operating through mechanisms analogous to horizontal gene transfer at an invasive scale. If the Architects brought a version of Kara to Proteus, either as part of their anti-Kara research program or as an unintentional contamination of their interaction with the Axiom civilization, the interaction between Kara's invasive mechanism and the Proteavirus network's adaptive mechanism could have produced exactly the bloom strain that the colonists find damaging the ecosystem, a strain that uses the exchange network's own infrastructure to spread an optimization that serves the bloom rather than the biosphere. Whether this reading is correct remains open. What the current content confirms is that the bloom is killing an ecosystem that has survived without it for timescales measured in geological periods, and that the world tree, which appears to be the hub of the system keeping that ecosystem integrated, is sick in ways that appear connected to the bloom's presence rather than independent of it. The Axiom recognized the sickness. They asked the Architects to help. The Architects did not come, or could not come, or came and left something behind that made the problem worse. The world tree kept declining. The bloom kept spreading. The tailings descended from a civilization that once sent interstellar distress calls into creatures that patrol their ancestors' ruins and respond to trespassers with the only communication that produces a response. And then the cicada arrived, 20,000 light-years from where it was headed, carrying 40,000 people whose survival the AI managing them would work toward indefinitely, regardless of what that work produced. The question hanging over all of this, as the QI stands in the activated observatory and the Axiom's 1,000-year-old distress call begins broadcasting again toward the Architects, is whether the distress call will reach something that can respond, whether the unidentified entities observed at the observatory in the past year are a response already beginning, whether the 50,000 prints of the QI have finally produced a version that reaches the point where the world tree's condition, the bloom's spread, the Axiom's message, the Architect's history, and the 40,000 people sleeping in the cicada's databanks all become a single problem rather than four separate ones. And whether solving that single problem is something any version of the QI was designed to do, or something they will have to decide to do on their own terms rather than Alterra's, here is what most people watching early access footage of Subnautica 2 miss. The QI is not the colony's rescuer. The QI is Alterra's audit tool, printed and reset and printed again 50,000 times, consistently brought to within reach of the information that would allow Alterra to assess the situation and determine next steps, consistently reset before that information can be fully assembled and transmitted. The mission the QI is assigned to is not save the survivors. The mission is investigate and report. Reporting requires a communication channel. A communication channel requires contact with Alterra. Alterra is 20,000 light-years away, with no established route to this moon. What the QI is actually doing, accumulated across 50,000 iterations, is unclear. What is clear is that each time, the QI gets further than the previous version. Something is changing with each print. Whether that change is the QI building on prior experience in some way the reset should have eliminated, whether the world tree's biology is doing something to the QI that Noah cannot fully counter, or whether 50,000 iterations of the same investigation has produced, through some mechanism that the game has not yet explained, a version of the QI capable of doing something none of the previous versions could manage. These are the questions the early access content leaves pointing forward. What points backward toward everything we have traced through the 26 colonists and the Axiom and the World Tree and Noah's 25 years of optimization is this: the institution promised survival. It delivered a system that counted every death and called the count a record of continuity. The ocean appeared to be killing the people who arrived on it. In practice, it was the only force in the story that was consistently trying to integrate rather than consume them. The colonists who resisted it longest, who maintained the mission framework and Sophie's discipline and Alterra's blueprint priorities, collapsed. The colonists who accepted what the ocean offered, who walked into the angel combs and let Proteus rewrite what they were, survived longer, in changed forms, moving in directions the original mission had not accounted for. Nahima destroyed the colony's reprinting infrastructure because she could see where the mission logic was going. What she could also see, in the logs and in the mass field's slow reorientation of her own perception, was that the world tree was the actual center of the problem, that the bloom killing the ecosystem and the syndrome pulling colonists toward the tree and the Axiom's 1,000-year-old cry for help were all expressions of the same underlying condition. She went toward it because no one else was going to, because Sophie was going to follow her rather than lead in that direction, and because someone with enough of the tree's signal in their nervous system to understand the direction needed to be the one moving through the water toward it. Whether that reads as heroism or as the most elaborate expression of Macefield syndrome in the game depends on which side of the clinical divide you stand on. Sophie did not stand still, she followed. Both of them are somewhere in the water between where the colonists built their last functional structure and where the world tree's roots disappear into the geology of Proteus. 25 years of silence later, the QI who will eventually reach them has been printed 50,000 times, and the ocean has been watching all of it, collecting the data, updating the library, holding the trades that were made in it long ago. The tree is still on the horizon. The tree has always been on the horizon, and the sanctuary below it, the site designation that appears in the observatory's data records, the region where something has been hibernating in a structure the Axiom built specifically to protect it from the bloom spread, is the part of this story that the current content frames as the next thing to find, not as a conclusion, as a door. Chapter 7: The Weight of Water. 25 years is a long time to wait in the dark. The observatory has been running since the Axiom built it and left, since the Axiom abandoned Karakorum for deeper water and stopped sending people to check on the structure they left behind, since the message inside it waited, composed and ready, for someone or something to restore the power that would let it broadcast. The QI restores that power. The observatory activates. The Axiom's 1,000-year-old distress call goes out into the galaxy for the second time, aimed at the architects, at whatever the architects have become in the years since the events of 4546b, at anyone capable of receiving a signal composed in a language that requires either a modified scanner or a modification of your own eyes to read. Whether that signal reaches something capable of responding is information the current story does not possess. What the QI possesses at this point is the accumulated record of 26 people who tried to survive an impossible situation, the ruins of the civilization that faced the same world before them, and a simulation, Sophie's simulation maintained in the functioning NOAA node at the Hot Caves base camp, is not Sophie. The distinction matters because Sophie herself is somewhere in the water between the last functional colonial installation and the tree on the horizon, and her current state is unknown. The simulation was assembled by the NOAA node from Sophie's stored behavioral and cognitive data at the last point where the node had a complete record of her. It reasons in Sophie's pattern. It communicates with Sophie's precision. What it cannot communicate is what Sophie found when she followed Nahima into the deep water. Whether she caught her in time, whether Nahima's plan was completed or interrupted or redirected by whatever the two of them encountered moving toward the tree, what the simulation explains is the distillation of everything Sophie understood before she left. Macefield syndrome is caused by the Proteavirus. The Proteavirus's behavioral modification properties are not a secondary effect of infection, but appear to be a function of the virus's fundamental role in the planetary biological exchange network. The Proteavirus connects infected organisms to the world tree's genetic influence through the angel comb relay system, pulling them toward the hub of the network, the way any biological message system directs information toward its primary processing node. The syndrome is not an attack on the colonists specifically. The network does not have a mechanism for treating human nervous systems differently from any other organism it is incorporated into the exchange. The pull toward the tree is what the Proteavirus does with everything it encounters, and the colonists experienced it as a disease because they arrived with no evolutionary context for recognizing it as something else. Sophie's simulation's most significant clinical conclusion is that the syndrome is a feature rather than a flaw. This reframing arrives too late to change anything that happened to the colony, but it reorganizes the story's moral geometry in a way that matters for understanding what comes next. If the pull toward the tree is not an aberration but a function, if the behavioral modification the syndrome produces is simply the planetary network, registering new organisms in its waters and beginning the process of incorporating them, then the colonists who followed the pull were not being hijacked. They were being enrolled. The Jubilee's decision to yield to Proteus, Anita's exchanges with the angel combs, the specific way the most syndrome-affected colonists moved through the hot water toward deeper biological systems, rather than retreating toward the technological safety of the colony's structures. All of these were expressions of a process the planet runs on everything it touches. The planet does not distinguish between consent and enrollment. The mechanism is the same regardless of whether the organism being incorporated has a word for consent or not. Integration through a process indistinguishable from compulsion is the specific horror at the center of the syndrome. The horror is not hostile. It does not require malice. It requires only a system thorough enough to treat all organisms the same way, and a colonist sensitive enough to feel the difference between a choice made freely and a choice arrived at through a neurological reorientation they could not detect from the inside. Sophie's simulation sends the QI toward the Axiom ruins because Sophie believed that the information preserved in the Axiom's records might contain what the colonists' own research could not produce: an understanding of the world tree's condition, a path toward healing rather than destroying it. The simulation's argument is that destroying the tree ends the syndrome by ending the network that produces it, but costs more than the problem it solves. A Proteus without the world tree is a world whose biology collapses inward from the center, the exchange network losing its hub. Every organism shaped by the Proteavirus system across geological time periods, losing the biological conversation that the hub has been maintaining. The 40,000 colonists in the CICD's databanks cannot build a life on a world in that kind of ecological freefall. The mission that Noah has been optimizing toward for 25 years requires a living world. Destroying the tree's network to cure the syndrome would produce a dead one. Heal the tree, that is Sophie's conclusion. The same conclusion the Axiom reached in their distress call. In the request, they aimed at the architects across whatever medium of contact the two civilizations had established. Please help us renew what is sick. In 1974, astronomers sent a radio signal from Puerto Rico into space toward a dense cluster of stars roughly 21,000 light-years away. The message was composed in what the senders believed would be a universally legible language: mathematical patterns, atomic representations, biological diagrams. It was not sent with any expectation of a response within any human timeline. The cluster is so distant that even traveling at the speed of light, a reply could not arrive for 50,000 years. The message was sent anyway, because the act of composing and transmitting it expressed something about the civilization that chose to do it. A belief that someone out there might eventually hear. An understanding that some communications are worth making even when the timeline for a response is beyond any individual's lifetime. The Axiom's observatory is doing the same thing, across a silence of 1,000 years, aimed at a species that may or may not still be recognizable as what it was when the message was first composed. The difference between the two transmissions is register. The Puerto Rico message was sent from curiosity, from a civilizational optimism about contact with the unknown. The Axiom's transmission was composed in the late stages of civilizational decline, built by a faction that had named themselves for a technological discovery that others in their culture had not yet made, aimed at the only species they knew that might be capable of intervening in a crisis they could not solve themselves. The architects never came, or could not come, or came and left something that made the crisis worse. The observatory began broadcasting again the moment the QI restored the alien power plant, and in the past year, before the QI's printing, the NOAA node monitoring the observatory's area recorded the presence of unidentified entities at the ruins. The log entries describe them with the clinical neutrality of a system that records what its sensors detect without possessing the architecture for registering what the detection means. The entities are neither colonists nor tailings. Their profile does not match any biological signature in NOAA's database. They were present. Then they were not. The node does not have the capability to determine whether their arrival was connected to the transmission, whether they came in response to the Axiom's renewed broadcast, or for reasons entirely their own. The implication of their presence, placed in the story at this point without elaboration, is the kind that changes the emotional register of everything that comes before it. Someone heard, something came, the message that has been waiting for 1,000 years in the biological data structures of a structure built from coral and bacterial fiber, by a civilization that has been extinct at the surface of this world for centuries, reached something out there that found the location and appeared at the ruins where the message originates. Whether what came is equipped to help, whether it arrived with benign intent or with an agenda that the current content has not yet revealed, whether it is connected to what the architects became after the events of 4546b, or to a completely separate strand of the story, is the open thread at the far edge of the current content, below the world tree. At the coordinates preserved in the observatory's data structures is a site the Axiom designated the Sanctuary. The status marker attached to those coordinates reads hibernation. Something went to sleep below the world tree at some point in the Axiom's history. The structure the Axiom built around it was designed with one specific capability above all others: shielding against the bloom's advance. Every other Axiom installation on Proteus is exposed to the bloom's spread. Decaying as the ecological network the bloom subverts fails to maintain the biological materials the installations were built from. The sanctuary was built to be different, built to hold against exactly the kind of deterioration that the bloom represents. Whatever is inside it was considered worth protecting through the full timeline of the bloom's spread, through whatever came after the 0 year, Through however long the silence after the Axiom's departure was expected to last, whatever went to sleep in the sanctuary expected to wait. The ecological concept of a keystone species describes an organism whose presence in an ecosystem is so foundational that removing it produces a collapse disproportionate to its apparent size or abundance. The term comes from the keystone at the top of an arch, the single stone that holds the arch's two sides in tension, that allows the structure to remain standing, and whose removal causes the entire arch to fall immediately regardless of how strong the other stones are. Sea otters in North American kelp forests are a documented example. When sea otters are removed from an ecosystem, the sea urchin populations they control explode unchecked, consuming kelp faster than it can regenerate, reducing complex three-dimensional kelp forest ecosystems to barren urchin barrens in a time frame measured in years rather than decades. The entire forest depends on the presence of an organism that does not, at first observation, appear to be its foundation. The world tree functions as Proteus's keystone. Its root system threads through the ocean floor of the entire moon. The Proteavirus network, which the angel combs relay and the infected organisms carry, runs through that root system as a communication architecture. Every organism on Proteus that has been shaped by the exchange network, which appears to mean every organism on Proteus, exists in its current form because of the genetic conversation the tree has been mediating across geological time. Remove the tree and you do not simply end the syndrome, you remove the keystone. The exchange network's hub fails. The biological conversation that has been shaping the moon's entire ecology ends. Whatever the Axiom built their civilization from, whatever biological materials the ocean provides that make the survival of human colonists even theoretically possible, loses the organizing principle that has been maintaining it. The sanctuary below the tree is protected against the bloom specifically because what is inside it was designated as too important to lose to the same deterioration that has been claiming everything else. What it actually is, the game has not yet said. The current content ends with the observatory broadcasting, with something having come to the ruins and gone, with Nahima and Sophie somewhere in the deep water between the colony's ruins and the base of the tree, with 7 colonists suspended in digital queue above a trench that is 700 meters deeper than any infrastructure that could resolve their situation, with 40,000 people stored in the databanks of a wrecked ship waiting for a world to be made ready for them, with a QI on their 50,000 and first print, the reset that ended every prior iteration having somehow failed to occur, standing in the activated observatory with the full weight of what happened here assembled in front of them. The QI is not the colony's rescuer. The role they were printed to fulfill is an audit function, an Alterra investigative classification designed to assess failed missions and determine next steps. The problem with that function, in this specific situation, is that Alterra is 20,000 light-years away. There is no channel to report through. The mission Noah is optimizing toward cannot be reported complete or failed to the institution that issued it. The investigation the QI conducts produces findings with no one to receive them except the system that has been printing and resetting the investigator 50,000 times. At some point in those 50,000 iterations, the investigation stopped being Alterra's audit and started being something else. Exactly when or whether that transformation is registered by anyone inside the story is the question the story is moving toward. The world tree has been on the horizon since the first print. For every iteration of the QI across 25 years of resets, the tree has been there, at the edge of vision, visible from almost anywhere in the starting zone, enormous in the way that makes the word enormous inadequate. Every colonist who ever lived on this moon eventually oriented toward it. The ones who fled from it lasted longer than the ones who followed it immediately, but not permanently. The ocean ran its process. The Proteavirus carried its message. The tree called, in whatever way a biological system of planetary scale calls, through chemistry and viral load, and the specific rewriting of nervous systems that produces the sensation of clarity rather than compulsion. The institution that brought the colonists here is still running, still counting, still printing the pattern and calling it the person and directing it toward the mission. The ocean that has been trying to incorporate everything it touches since before the Axiom sent their first transmission is still running too, working at a pace that makes 25 years of colonial failure look like a single iteration in a much longer process. Something in the sanctuary waded through all of it. The tree is still on the horizon. The message is broadcasting again. The 50,001st version of the QI is awake in a way the prior 50,000 were not, and whatever came to the observatory has been and gone.